Thank you for joining us this evening. You are now attending the webinar entitled Why You Should Start Teaching Ursula Parrott's Ex-Wife, 1929. Our leader for this session is Marsha Gordon, NAC Fellow 2019-2020, Professor of English, Director of the Film Studies Program at North Carolina State University. I'd also like to acknowledge Mary Lanker. Mary is a member of this year's Teacher Advisory Council who will serve as our TA for tonight's session. She will be active in the chat, sharing thoughts and resources and asking questions. Again, our good friend and Teacher Advisory Council member, and actually former member of our Teaching African American Studies Institute, Mary Lanker from Decatur, Illinois. Mary, thank you for joining us. We appreciate you. Dr. Marsha Gordon is the film studies professor at North Carolina State University who loves researching, writing, and speaking about American film and culture. She regularly introduces movies, moderate panels, make radio and podcast appearances, and lectures on an array of topics. Her latest book, Becoming the Ex-Wife, The Unconventional Life and Forgotten Writings of Ursula Parrott, was supported by a National Humanities Center's fellowship, an NEH Public Scholar Fellowship. With Robert Coker, Dr. Gordon co-wrote the 5th edition of the Introduction to Film Studies textbook, Film, Form, and Culture, which Routledge will publish in March of 2024, this month. She's also the author of Film is Like a Battleground, Sam Fuller's War Movies and Hollywood Ambitions, Celebrity in the Movie Age, and the co-editor of Learning with Lights Off, a reader in educational film and screening race in American non-theatrical film. She has co-directed 3 short documentaries, Nesting, about a bird's nest in historical small-town American newspapers, All the Possibilities, about a single extraordinary painting by Vernon Pratt, and Rendered Small, about a unique collection of American folk art buildings. Her latest documentary in progress is This Beautiful Vision, which is being supported by a 2024 Bagliasco Foundation Fellowship. Dr. Gordon has given talks all over the United States as well as in London, Amsterdam, Vienna, and Prague. She's introduced films at the National Gallery of Art, the National Archives, the Museum of Moving Image, the Hammer Museum, the Czech National Film Archive, the Austrian Film Museum, the North Carolina Museum of Art, and many, many other venues. To our network of teachers, both nationally and internationally. Without further ado, I present to you our scholar and leader for this session, Dr. Marsha Gordon. Dr. Gordon, Marsha, we are honored to have you with us tonight, and we look forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you so much, Mike, and thank you, everyone, for tuning in. My goal with this presentation is to encourage you to give this novel a shot in your classrooms and to make it much easier for you to incorporate it into your curricula. As Mike mentioned, my PowerPoint will be available to everybody who is on this webinar, which means you will have access to a lot of media-rich material should you choose to use it, and you are welcome to. So I've divided this talk into 4 sections. The first is going to introduce you to Ursula Parrott, tell you a little bit about her life, her literary and cultural contributions. Then I'm going to talk about her 1929 bestseller, Ex-Wife, and some of the things that make it so wonderful and interesting. Next, I'll talk about Parrott's significant influence in Hollywood, and I'm specifically going to talk about the Academy Award-winning adaptation of Ex-Wife, which came out in 1930. And finally, I'm going to talk about expanding the Jazz Age literary canon. I'll talk about The Great Gatsby and what it means to try to move a figure like Ursula Parrott from the margins to the center. But first, who is Ursula Parrott? I suspect that many of you had not heard of her until this webinar, so I'm really looking forward to telling you a little bit about her life. So she was born Catherine Ursula Towle in Boston on March 26, 1899, to Irish Catholic parents. Her father, Henry Towle, was a family doctor in the Irish enclave of Dorchester, which was a suburb of Boston. From 1912 to 1916, Catherine attended the Girls' Latin School, which was the female offshoot of the venerable male-only Boston Latin School. Girls' Latin School opened its doors in 1878, which was a year before the Harvard Annex, which eventually became Radcliffe, where women could attend a Harvard-like education. So Tal was really lucky because she had the fortune of being raised in a region that was at the vanguard of women's education, and also of having parents that had progressive beliefs. So when you wanted to send your daughter to Boston Latin Girls School, she would only be considered if you gave written assurance that you would send her to college afterwards if she wanted to attend college. So Catherine Tal was one of 17 girls from her class at Girls Latin School to take honors in her Radcliffe entrance examinations before graduating from high school in 1916. By the way, all of her classmates went to college. So 20 of them joined her at Radcliffe, and the remainder pursued degrees at one of the other Seven Sisters colleges. Tal, who majored in English at Radcliffe, was not exactly a bookworm, as her report card from the Harvard archives indicates here. She had a notoriously spotty attendance record and middling grades, although she did pull off an A in Slavic. So despite significant bumps on the college road, she graduated from Radcliffe in 1920, after which her father urged her to stay home and teach English in a convent, which the more I tell you about the future Ursula Parrott, the more you will find this hard to believe. But she said, I won that battle by getting a newspaper job. And this was the first time that writing allowed Catherine Tal to control her own fate. And basically, after 2 years of working as an unbylined journalist, Tal reapplied to Radcliffe in 1922 with the intention of earning a master's degree in English. But she only attended Radcliffe for one partial semester because she fell in love with a recent Princeton grad and so altered the course of her life. So Kitty Tal, as she was nicknamed, eloped to Greenwich Village in 1922 with a fellow journalist and recent Princeton grad named Lindsay Mark Parrott. I love this document. I love looking at archival documents on the screen. There is their marriage certificate, and you'll note that the bride has no place to list an occupation. That's where the blue arrow is. There's just a maiden name if a widow. I really think showing students primary documents like this marriage certificate helps with conveying a sense of cultural context, and in this case, really sheds light on the times in which Parrott was living. So the couple had a son named Lindsay Mark Parrott, who went by Mark, in 1923, and then went through a difficult and long separation, which resulted in divorce in 1928. And Ursula Parrott found herself in her late 20s, a divorcee with a child and herself to support, and without any clear path to take. But she was college educated after all, so she got a job writing advertisements for department stores. So she would be writing copy that would go out in magazines to sell furs and hats and lingerie and so on. And she had a series of revelations. The first was that she was not alone, by which I mean she was not the only divorcee who had to work to raise her son. She saw that there were a lot of women who were ex-wives doing the same thing as her, and also single mothers, unmarried mothers. The second was that she didn't love the work. She thought it was vapid. The third was that she was a pretty good writer, which was an important revelation that had significant consequences because she ended up writing a book which was an only slightly fictionalized version of her travails and adventures, and anonymously published it in August of 1929. And that book was called Ex-Wife. By the way, the anonymous was a marketing stunt. The publisher picked her middle name as her pen name. She kept her married last name, and her name was attached to the book very quickly. But if you publish a book anonymously, there is automatically a little bit of sensation that goes along with it. So this was just an intentional marketing gimmick that got corrected before the book really even came out. It is no underestimation to say that the book changed the course of her life overnight. This is a tale from the trenches of marriage, infidelity, divorce, dating, and remarriage in Manhattan. Ex-Wife is filled with conflict between the sexes and conversations between women about the logistics of post-marital life. It proceeds from Patricia's point of view, as the novel details the dissolution of her marriage to Peter and her transition into life as an ex-wife. And I think the novel's female perspective is really important, especially if you consider placing it alongside a male-narrated novel of the Jazz Age, like The Great Gatsby, for example, which many people already teach. And I think it's a pretty brilliant snapshot of a woman's complicated experiences in Jazz Age Manhattan. I'm not alone in this. It was a sensation and a bestseller, and Ursula Parrott got her first paycheck at a very special time in American history. She got it in October of 1929. So you can see here's an advertisement in the New York Daily Mirror for the serialization of Ex-Wife, and check out that headline on Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929, the all-caps headline at the top of the Daily Mirror, 9 billions lost, Morgan deserts market, and at the bottom of that front page, you see that Ex-Wife is thrown out in storm. So her book was being serialized in the newspaper at the moment that the stock market crashed. Ex-Wife, by the way, had been out of print for many decades. When I started doing my research, I had to buy my copies of all of her books on eBay, but I have good news for you. Ex-Wife was recently republished by McNally Editions. Actually, it was just a week after my biography of Parrott came out, and Faber has acquired international rights, so it's being translated into half a dozen languages right now for European distribution. So if any of you are in Spain or Italy or France or Germany, it's coming your way soon. The point is that it is readily available and adoptable. So from the late 1920s to the late 1940s, Ursula Parrott used her writing to explore what she called maxims in the copybook of modernism. She published 20 books, several of them bestsellers, and well over 100 short stories, articles, and novel-length magazine serials. It was not unusual for Ursula Parrott to earn $10,000 or more for a substantial short or multi-part story in the 1930s, which is around $200,000 in today's money, adjusted for inflation. This is a lot of money. She had brief but lucrative stints working in Hollywood, as well as for New York-based movie studios. Her book and movie deals, as well as her marriages, divorces, there were 4 total marriages and divorces, I should say, and her run-ins with the law, and there were some of those too, regularly generated newspaper headlines. She was a world traveler, a partner in a rural Connecticut newspaper called the Connecticut Nutmeg, by the way, best newspaper title ever. She was an informant in a federal drug investigation, and as pictured on the screen, she was a pilot in the Civil Aeronautics Administration during World War II. For the most part, despite the marriages and divorces, she was an unmarried mother for most of her life with strong beliefs about child rearing, which she shared with the reading public whenever given the opportunity, which is in itself a bit unusual. She was very outspoken about being a mother and never felt that there was anything wrong with raising her son on her own. Over the course of her career, Ursula Parrott wrote thousands of pages about modern life, and especially about the modern woman, probing the perplexing times in which she lived. Her experiences with marriages, divorces, and raising a child, with career ambitions and loneliness, with birth control and abortions, with alcohol and depression, made their way into the pages of her stories, which are often about how women broke with much of what had previously both constrained and protected them. Ursula frequently bemoaned her imperfect balancing acts as she tried to find the right mate to co-pilot the ship of life while balancing a demanding writing career that supported her unconventional family and lifestyle. And one of the reasons she could do what she did is that she had an older, never married sister named Lucy Towle, who acted as Mark's caregiver, both in their Boston home before Dr. Towle died. And then Ursula Parrott largely lived in New York City, but she bought an estate in Connecticut that she could take the trains to on the weekends. And Lucy also helped raise Mark there, in addition to him going to boarding schools, which was a very common practice, of course, in the Northeast for people of great wealth. And she was one of them for at least a time. One of the things I did when I started researching and writing my biography was to read everything that Parrott wrote, every book, every story, every serialized novel. And of course, the only reason I could do this is that I had the support of amazing fellowships, such as my fellowship at the National Humanities Center and my NEH Public Scholar. But considered wholly, I think I can honestly say I'm the only person on the planet who has probably ever done this, but I'm certainly the only person alive today who has. So considered holistically and through the lens of feminism, which is actually a bit complicated when it comes to Parrott, and I'm happy to talk about this during the discussion. It's fair to say that Parrott exposed dilemmas that Betty Friedan would later describe in The Feminine Mystique in 1963, that Helen Gurley Brown would imagine pushing past and having it all in 1982, and that Sheryl Sandberg would encourage women to transcend in her 2013 Lean In. Parrott wrote about women stumbling through frustrating rituals of modern courtship and proto-hookup culture. She wrote about paying bills and keeping things together when women's lovers or husbands failed to hold up their end of the bargain. She wrote about raising children whose fathers were absent because their liberated views allowed them to shirk responsibility. And she also wrote about women who numbed themselves from the miseries of modernity with alcohol. It is easy to see reflections of her life in her fiction because she wrote about what she knew. And I think young people reading her writing now are really stunned by the resonances with contemporary life and by how modern her writing actually is. I've talked to a number of young people at my events who have come across this book because they read something about it or saw it on TikTok or Instagram. I'm talking about Ex-Wife, Parrott's Ex-Wife. And they love the book. They say it changed their lives, that they can't believe that almost 100 years ago, a woman was writing like this. So it's very resonant. So I will give a couple of examples. This is personal writing. She regularly observed what we would now call structural inequalities, complaining that women, quote, don't quite earn as much as men, despite the fact that it costs them just as much to live. Savings in food offset by greater clothes expense. So they're more likely than young men to be in recurrent jams, end quote. She called out instances of sexual harassment, describing her first publisher, Jonathan Cape, who was 20 years her senior, as a white-haired, sturdy, ambitious man who mauled her between calls. He's a grand person, Parrott proclaimed flippantly and with a qualifier, if he'd keep his hands where they belong. She was even more indignant when a banker told her that she should, quote, always borrow from his bank by suggesting payment in kindness. I refused to do anything about it, Parrott proudly declared, and he never suggested it again, the outcome of which was that I pay him 6% interest, like all the men who borrow from them. So had Ursula Parrott been alive today, instead of writing letters in which she complained about these matters privately, she might have tweeted about them, or whatever we call this now, with the Me Too hashtag and the rallying cry of time's up. But again, she was doing this almost 100 years ago. So just to sum up part one of my talk, Parrott was wildly successful, was grappling with and writing about the most pressing issues of the day facing women like her, which I should say means, of course, her milieu was white, educated, relatively affluent, and living in a major city in the Northeast. And I think her topics are really evergreen, to use a term that they use today. So I'm happy to answer questions if there are any at this juncture, Mike.
All right, good deal. Thank you so much. And I'd encourage everyone, if you have any questions, please feel free to enter them in the Manage Q&A. We have a question from Miguel. Miguel's question is, are there specific excerpts or chapters that you think would pair well with The Great Gatsby?
Yeah, and I'm going to turn now to talking about the novel, and I'm going to actually share a couple passages. So maybe this is the place to just transition to the novel and to do that. What do you think, Mike?
Good deal.
Okay.
I think that will work.
Okay, and I saw the question about married 5 times, no, 4 times. Okay, so now let's talk about Ex-Wife and about why it deserves a spot on your syllabi. And hopefully, Miguel, I'll answer your question. So you're looking now at the back of Dell's 1940 mapback edition of the book. This is like a cheap paperback edition that came back, a decade plus after the book initially came out. But what I love about this is, it's a map of Manhattan, and it's an indication of how much New York City is embedded into the fabric of the novel. I think this is one of the great novels of New York City, and I hope it comes back into fashion for that reason, among others. But Ex-Wife begins with a stripped-down, unsentimental declaration. My husband left me 4 years ago. Why, I don't precisely understand, and never did, nor, I suspect, does he. What proceeds after this is a fascinating and very frank novel with a dramatic term that stems from infidelities committed by both husband and wife. First by the husband, who confesses and is forgiven, and then a kind of reciprocity by the wife, which is confessed and not forgiven. So the novel is about, well, first off, the double standard, but it's also really about the need for female self-sufficiency and female friendship, and the difficulties facing the first generation of women confronted with work-life balance. And so when I've talked to 20 and 30-something people about ex-wife today, they say it reminds them of Sex in the City, but just, with different things in style. And I think that's not an unfair comparison in some ways. In between beautifully described passages about fashion and work and nightlife, Parrott does not shy away from difficult subject matter, including domestic and sexual violence, as well as an artfully and very movingly handled abortion scene that is incredibly relevant. One of the novel's central divorcees sums up the state of marriage for women of her generation who were witnessing its decline from within. This is a quote from the book. Brought up under the tattered banners of love everlasting and all for purity, we have to adapt ourselves to life in the era of the one-night stand. This is a really unbelievable line to me, because what it's really acknowledging is that this young generation of women who were brought up during the war, during World War I, and all of the death and excess of that time period, coming out of the Victorian age and all of the kind of conservative expectations about morality and propriety, have been kind of shoved off a cliff into this world where you're supposed to be permissive and modern, and it's complicated and it's not easy. And the novel absolutely does not advocate for hedonism, though it was often misunderstood in this way when it came out. Rather, it actually offers a very strong case for the protections of lasting marriage and the dangers of being an unattached woman, and some of the downstream consequences of feminism. And so I think one of the great things about this book is it really opens up the opportunity to talk about a lot of issues, many of which remain unresolved. Okay. So in Ex-Wife, Patricia's divorce occurs in a courtroom scene that takes place 2/3 of the way through the book. She describes it as, quote, just an incident in the career of a modern woman. As was often the case in New York, where adultery was the only legal grounds for divorce, the transgression that earns this couple theirs is staged for the sake of the courts. Pete paid a poor little unwashed wench, as she's described, $50 to pretend to be his lover, which Pat, or Patricia, helps orchestrate. After she's granted the divorce, Pat rushes home to change clothes before heading into the office. It is truly just another day in the life of a modern woman. Although the word had been used for some time in newspaper articles about high-profile divorce settlements, evaded alimony payments, property and name use disputes, remarriages, and even an occasional murder, Ursula Parrott had named and described the life of a type of woman who had seemingly just arrived on the scene en masse. Divorce rates had been steadily rising in the 1920s, and critics saw this as the pernicious cost of allowing personal choice to determine the course of a marriage, eroding the institution to the point of meaningless impermanence. The behavioral psychiatrist John B. Watson predicted in 1930 that there would, in fact, be no marriages by 1980, at which point every woman will train herself for economic independence. And again, it's really interesting to look back at the way people kind of sounded off these doom and gloom scenarios and predicted, marriageless, childless futures, because women had entered the public sphere and really were making a great success of it in many cases. But the novel also asks who was really benefiting from increased female self-sufficiency, and in Ex-Wife, Patricia offers a very cynical take. Ex-wives, young and handsome ex-wives like us, illustrate how this freedom for women turned out to be God's greatest gift to men. And this is the interesting twist in Ursula Parrott's take on marriage, marriage and divorce and the modern age, which is that she actually thought that all of this women's self-sufficiency and equality ultimately benefited men because it freed them from a certain amount of responsibility to take care of women. So Ex-Wife was marketed to readers as a sociological document and somewhat implausibly also as a book of marital advice, which, quote, should be read by women before and after marriage as a warning that a wrecked home may mean a ruined life. A little sensational copy there, but it sold books, right? It is true that Parrott's novel explores her generation's failings, showing what one reviewer calls the hopeless despair of wrecked ideals lurking under the alluring glamour of women's freedom. Perhaps not surprisingly, this reviewer neglects the male freedom that inspires Patricia's reciprocal behavior. So in the fall of 1929, Ex-Wife shared space with Ernest Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms on both Brentano's and Baker and Taylor's list of best-selling fiction, and Macy's department store placed Ex-Wife fourth on their bestseller list, just behind Eric Maria Remarque's devastating World War I novel, All Quiet on the Western Front. Publishers Weekly reported that 100,000 copies of Ex-Wife were sold during its initial publication run. So Ursula Parrott's first check from her publisher, which she had anticipated would be good-sized, arrived in October 1929, the month of the stock market crash, which was perfect timing, right? Because had she gotten it too much before then, it might have ended up in the stock market. This check was for $16,000, which is roughly $250,000 in today's dollars. The Nation credited the novel with possessing an intangible quality of truth, describing it as an interesting portrait of a particular type of post-war woman. In the New York Herald Tribune, reviewer Florence Haxton praised Parrott's book for capturing a growing tendency among young women to scrutinize with skeptic eye this freedom which their mothers fought for and stubbornly won with exultation by questioning the values of choosing a job instead of marrying it. A great phrase. Although the New York Times deemed Parrott's writing, quote, often sloppy, their reviewer had to admit the avidity with which the novel was being read. He left his copy of Ex-Wife idle on the couch for only a few minutes before his wife was flipping over the pages with another wife reading over her shoulder. So Parrott's debut novel, he conceded, successfully channeled the zeitgeist of contemporary marital relations and contributed what he called a new descriptive tag to the American language, and that was ex-wife. Of course, as I said, this is not the first time it's being used, but Parrott really popularized the term. I think gender in book reviewing is like a whole other subject, and it would be interesting to put the Haxton review next to the anonymous New York Times reviewer, just to talk about the way that they frame and experience the story so differently. I will say as a kind of fun side note that indicates what a phenomenon the book was. There were 4 ex-wife parody books that came out in succession. The first was Ex-Husband, which was also anonymously published and became a bestseller. There was Ex-Mistress, there was Ex-It, and the most delightfully absurd entree into the field, Ex-Baby, which begins with the mock mournful declaration, "I had a wonderful time while it lasted." And so I am going to give a few specific examples from the novel, and I went ahead and scanned the first edition pages for you to look at on the screen, but I will also tell you in the McNally Editions version, this is on page 126. I'm so glad that Mike was playing Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue because that is exactly what is being referred to in this beautiful passage that includes the musical bars from it. So this is Parrott's kind of best friend, woman friend in the novel, Lucia. They're talking about their lives. And I love the experiment and the energy of the city in this prose and the way that, again, the kind of modernity of it with the musical bars. So Sam gave Lucia an orthophonic phonograph for a birthday present. Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue was almost the only record we ever played on it. We turned that on about once an hour when we were home. Even that kind of detail, you know, to talk to students about the way they consume media, I think it's a really cool opportunity. The tune matches New York, Lucia said, the New York we know. It has gaiety and color and irrelevancy and futility and glamour as beautifully blended as the ingredients in crepe Suzette. I said, it makes me think of skyscrapers and Harlem and liners sailing and newsboys calling extras. It makes me think I'm 20 years old and on the way to owning the city, Lucia said. Start it over again, will you? And then the musical notes. And the song is played throughout the chapter this way. And of course, anyone reading this in 1929 would have been able to conjure the song in their head very easily. So I think this is a really nice evocation of the energy of the city and these women just having this conversation about their lives. The second excerpt I want to share is from page 112 of the McNally edition. And this is an imagination of women's working lives. This is Patricia's job working as an advertising copywriter in a department store. Does that sound familiar? I was an assistant advertising manager within one step of having a secretary of my own. I had already a private office with a desk and a rug and a typewriter and a window and a telephone that rang 20 times an hour. I love the energy of all those ands. It was the 5th anniversary of my marriage. I was sad about that for 10 minutes in a cab on my way to work. And I might be sad about it again on my way home from work. In the interval, I was very busy answering the telephone and hoping I would be an advertising manager and have a secretary to answer it soon. So one of the things that Parrott does throughout this book is the voice of Patricia in her mind. She doesn't dwell on her problems and her disappointments. She tries to get past them because she really believes that she has to present as this very strong, possessed woman who is not as emotionally damaged by the hurts she experiences as she is. And then look at the way the energy of this unfurls. It rang. The millinery buyer wanted extra space on the Friday page. I said I would let her know definitely later. It rang. The typographer wanted to know where the cuts for the rotogravure page were because the Times had called him to find out when it would be ready. I told him to telephone the engraver. I told someone in the department to telephone the engraver and rush him. I began an ad on, "We are 74 years young." It was a prestige ad. A prestige ad is a thing on which store owners spend money, sorrowfully, because the other store owners spend money on prestige ads sorrowfully. The telephone rang. The lingerie buyer, I could go on, right? But just the kind of pace of her working life and the sense that she's depleting herself so much throughout the day kind of plays into this burnout that Parrott depicts both in this novel and in her other writing. I don't know another woman writer who was writing about women's burnout in this time period, and I think she does it really beautifully, kind of depicting the details of a day in the life of a woman aspiring to be an executive. And the final scene I wanted to share with you is the abortion scene, so you can get a sense of what that's like. I realize that you all teach at different kinds of places and have different kinds of rules governing the material in your classrooms, but I want you to see what this is like because it's really quite powerful and artfully handled. This is on page 33 of the McNally edition, and I'll just read from the part that begins Saturday. It's like a diary entry, the way she presents it. I dressed with extreme care, with the feeling that I might be turning up a corpse before sunset, and that did not matter very much, but I would prefer to be a well-groomed one. Again, that kind of putting on a steely face. Bath salts were pleasant. Very beautifully tailored gloved silk underthings were pleasant against the skin. Life had been full of rather nice sensations like that once, and why not enjoy what remained of them? The doctor was calling for me at 10 o'clock. Peter had gone to work. I had said to him, "I'm having an abortion this morning." He had said, "Your show, hope it's not too bad." I wonder if those are the last words from Peter in this life. Okay, Peter is a monster, in case you didn't notice from just this one exchange. Well, be a credit to that extremely kind young doctor. Cold cream, skin food, astringent, rouge, powder, lipstick. Enormous gray eyes I have, fringed with thick black lashes, and an awfully white skin, considering how black and straight my hair is. Wonder if it is true that my great-grandfather found romance with an Indian girl and that accounted for the straight, very black hair. Wonder if he was nice to her. Beautiful detail, right? Given what she's going through, just this kind of subtle hearkening back to her grandfather's generation and the way men treat women. Black hair, black eyebrows, lovely shoulders, very white, and a lot they had got for me first and last. More than anything else had got me, though, at that. A woman, 5'1", weighing 109 pounds. Would I be a paragraph in various newspapers among the day's casual deaths? Probably not. So I'll stop with that. But this, I find this writing so powerful in the way that it's navigating this. Birth control and abortion were equally illegal in 1929, and so the way that this character has to deal with the consequences of sex is, I think, a really worthwhile conversation to have. The rest of the passage, let me just mention one other thing about it that I think is really quite artful. All of the feelings that Patricia has, all of her sadness and despair, gets expressed in parentheses. So it's not even something that Parrott allows this character to think out loud. It's bracketed off because she's trying to put on this good face. So the bottom line is that Ex-Wife was not a celebration of the new woman. It was not a celebration of hedonism. It was a warning about and for new women, written by someone who had, during her first 30 years of life, witnessed and experienced the consequences of a dramatic recalibration of gender expectations and really a complete upending of domestic life. I will also say that Ursula Parrott published a manifesto in December of 1929, not long after Ex-Wife was published, and it was called Leftover Ladies, which was almost the title of my biography. And it tackles the big ideas that she trotted out in the novel. I shared this resource with everyone who registered for the webinar, and I think it would make a really good companion reading with the novel in terms of talking about some of the kind of issues and arguments she's making about women at this time. So before I move on to the Hollywood adaptation, are there any questions, Mike?
Indeed. So I'll preface this question with another question. So
yes.
You mentioned the satirical accounts of her book, The Ex-Husband. So were they indicative of how her work was received by her contemporaries?
Were the parodies?
Yeah, the parodies by some of her contemporaries at the time, or I'm just wondering about the how they played on the book title in any way.
Well, it was. I think what it indicates is how successful the novel was, right? That people were trying to piggyback. This is what happens, right? Somebody makes a movie, it's very successful, and then there's kind of spin-offs and iterations, and it's the same thing with publishing. And so I think in some ways it's a great tribute to what a hooky concept, she had for the book. And you can see this happening with other novels and other stories and concepts in the 1920s. I don't know if it was a particularly friendly decade for the kind of publishing hook that then gets reiterated for the sake of profit. But I think it just suggests how much she was channeling the zeitgeist.
Good deal. And to follow that, Alex's question is, after the book came out, how did it affect people's, I guess, views towards separation and divorce? And I would broaden that by saying the larger social effects, maybe of how it was, how it affected, liberation movements at the time, or the ideas of women, and encouraged them to speak out more. But his question focused on separation and divorce, but I want to think a little bit broader.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that question, Alex. There's a few different ways to answer this. One is, of course, we have no idea how this impacted individual marriages or marriage in the country. What I will say is it was absolutely part of a conversation that was happening everywhere in the 1920s and 1930s. And if you pick up a Ladies' Home Journal, a Cosmopolitan, a Red Book, if you read articles by pundits at every level of the culture, they are talking about marriage, divorce, the state of the American family, women in the workplace. These are all really popular, important subjects. And so I would say that Ursula Parrott was participating and maybe at the kind of avant-garde of a conversation about these subjects, and this is certainly reflected in Hollywood films of the period too, which are obsessed with marriage and divorce and career women. And so, so I think that's what's important, is that Parrott wrote this book at a time where people were hungry to have the conversation, right? And she gave a kind of a door opening to having the conversation about the issue. I don't think that there's any scenario where, you read a book like this and go, oh, divorce is a great idea, in part because the novel is arguing against divorce. Actually, it's entirely Peter's idea to have the divorce. She wants to stay married. She has forgiven him his trespass, but he will not forgive her hers. And so it's really what she wants more than anything is to have a second chance, and he won't give that to her.
All right. Thank you so much. We're fine to move ahead. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, so let's move to Hollywood. Ursula Parrott's influence in Hollywood was really significant, and I'm really going to focus on the Academy Award-winning 1930 film adaptation of Ex-Wife, but there were 10 film adaptations of Ursula Parrott's work, and these were concentrated in the 1930s, as you can see from the filmography on the screen. But she also wrote other scripts, and there were numerous reports of films going into production as well. So MGM, which is one of the big studios, snapped up the film rights for Ex-Wife for $20,000, which is roughly $300,000 or so in today's money. But it was easier to buy than to produce. First off, it's a pre-code film, which means that you could get away with more risque fare than after 1934, when Hollywood's in-house self-censorship really began in earnest. But still, it was made at a time of escalating scrutiny of the movies. So at first, MGM was told by the Hays office, or the production code office, that Ex-Wife could not be used as a title for a talkie, nor could the theme be employed. Well, that was a pretty costly prohibition for MGM. So they classed up the title to the maybe more elegant The Divorcee, and they reworked the story and were given permission to proceed with some conditions, including they could not mention the title Ex-Wife in advertising, because to do so, and this is in a memo form, quote, would be to shortchange the public by leading it to believe that the screen version was a faithful adaptation. For those of you who teach any version of film and literature, I think this is a really great test case for thinking through ideas of adaptation. In the advertisements for the movie, MGM never mentions the book's title because they couldn't, but they always mention Ursula Parrott as the author of the story. And of course, everybody would have known because this was the water cooler book of 1929, right? So every review of the movie noted the source, right? There's still freedom of the press, even if there were advertising restrictions. And for example, look at the first sentence of the review that's up on the slide now. You cannot suppress a good marketing hook. The promotional tagline for the film was, "Her sin was no greater than his, but she was a woman." So like the book it was based on, it is a film about infidelity. And although it has an ending that significantly deviates from the novel, a very Hollywood second chance ending, it retains a lot of Parrott's ideas about how reckless and disappointing modern behavior could actually be. Not surprisingly, there are significant omissions. There are no traces of many of the worst experiences of the novel's female protagonists, which I think is in itself very instructive and interesting if you chose to teach the film alongside the book. And I wanted to show you a clip from the film. I'm really struck by how bold this film is in many ways and how dimensional a character Jerry is. Jerry is Patricia, renamed to Jerry, played by Norma Shearer. And she's much more dimensional than her male counterpart, as you will see. At this point in the film, Ted, who is Peter, renamed, played by Chester Morris, has not been faithful to Jerry, but she forgives him. And Jerry has reciprocated the infidelity with his best friend. It's handled very subtly. And this is Jerry's confession moment. And note that this is done in a long, unedited take, so it really allows the performers to do their work. So let's go ahead and roll that clip, Mike, if you would.
I didn't really intend to. But that's how it is. I had to tell you. Don't look at me like that, Ted.
You don't mean that, Jerry.
I'm telling you the truth.
Who's the man?
Oh, Ted, don't be conventional.
Who's the man? I want to see him.
Isn't it a rather good time to remember what you said? That it doesn't mean a thing?
Shut up, you! Can't be true. Well, I always thought you were the most decent thing in the world. Can't be true.
Well, it is. I'm going to work, Ted. I'm late. See you tonight.
So one of the things that I love about that scene is that it's not over dramatized, right? This is not an overacted, over dramatic scene, even though it's really airing this idea of the double standard, I think in a very interesting way. And I also love the way this film depicts male devastation. This was kind of a Parrott plot specialty. Jerry is very resilient, right? She's like going off to work. She's kind of dealt with her business and put her modern woman face on. But it's the men in Ursula Parrott's stories and then in the films that get adapted from them that really struggle with getting past things and moving on. And I also love Norma Shearer's kind of composure, her physical presence in the scene and her gestures. I think that the Divorcée has some really nice stylistic moments. Robert Z. Leonard, who directed the film, was a very competent studio director. And I want to show you just one other short clip. This is from a post-divorce run-in scene that the ex-couple has on New Year's Eve. And in the upper left of the screen, you see these hands in front of a minister. There's actually two weddings in the first part of the film. And the one you see on screen is Jerry and Ted's wedding. And note the way that the hands return in this second short clip from the film. And we can roll it.
I just want to wish you a Happy New Year.
Same to you. Don't let me keep you from your friend.
Oh, I couldn't think of accepting such a valuable gift.
But, my dear, my feeling for you is purely platonic.
Really? I've heard platonic love, but I didn't know there was such a thing as platonic jewelry.
My dear Jerry, you American women are so cold.
Are you sure you can tell whether a woman is cold or careful?
Oh, ma bien-aimée, quand je m'abîme dans tes yeux, tu fais battre mon cœur comme aucune femme ne l'a fait avant. Je suis à toi, absolument à toi, éternellement.
I don't understand French, but I know the symptoms of high blood pressure in any language.
Oh.
By the way, Jerry, I see your husband around quite a lot.
Oh, yes? Well, the next time you see him, you tell him I'm still holding my own.
I didn't know you had a husband, Jerry.
I had, but I haven't.
Let's drink to his health, the infernal fool.
So I think this is such a smart, witty way to play off the hands in relation to the matrimonial bonds that are established earlier in the film versus this kind of shallow sexual debauchery. Released as the country was descending into the Great Depression, this film became a much-needed smash for MGM and for the cash-starved theaters who booked it. The film cost $341,000 to produce, and it grossed over $1.2 million. Billed as the talkie of talkies, which is important because this is a film that comes out still in the transitional period between silent and sound film. Critics describe The Divorcee as an immensely entertaining social problem film that would inspire some very interesting conversations between husbands and wives on their way home from the theater. And although she would be nominated 5 times during her career, The Divorcee earned Norma Shearer her only Academy Award for Best Actress. The Divorcee is readily available on DVD in TCM's Forbidden Hollywood series, and it streams on Apple TV. And my experience of screening this film on several college campuses over the course of the past year as I've been on my book tour is that students love this film. They are appalled and intrigued by the male hypocrisy in it. They talk back at the screen. They are curious about Jerry's studied flippancy and her irreverence. And yeah, I think it would really teach quite nicely with Ex-Wife. So Ursula Parrott, I should say, made her first trip to Hollywood in April of 1931. Of all the writers brought to Hollywood, Molly Merrick wrote in her newspaper column, Ursula Parrott is perhaps coining the most money at the moment, which is really saying something. The Boston Globe's Hollywood correspondent Mamie Oberpeak went so far as to describe Parrott as the creator of the modern woman. Ursula Parrott was a major player. She was part of Paramount's Great Writers Campaign of 1931. You can see her there on the typewriter keyboard in their ad. She made regular appearances in the Fan magazine. And when I was researching my biography, I was repeatedly struck by how a woman like this gets forgotten. It's really quite extraordinary. I want to say just another couple quick things about Parrott in Hollywood before I move on. Parrott was one of 10 authors to contribute a chapter to The Woman Accused, which was published in Liberty Magazine. It was a serial in 1933 in partnership with Paramount, who then produced a film version. It starred the charming Nancy Carroll and Cary Grant in the starring roles. And what I love most about this film is not the film itself, which is okay, but it has a few seconds of celebrity author footage in its opening sequence, and this is the only moving image footage of Ursula Parrott that survives, and I urge you, if you have a blink in you, to get it done with before Mike plays the clip, because otherwise you'll miss it. So go ahead, Mike. There you go. That's it. And I'm thrilled to have even that little bit instead of nothing. So I have taught several of the films adapted from Parrott's writings in a variety of contexts. And if you were looking to build out a film unit on modern women, I just want to briefly recommend 2 other films that I'd especially think would make a good contenders. One is Next Time We Love from 1936, based on Parrott's 1935 novel, Next Time We Live. This is a story of 2 career-hungry characters, and it begins with Cicely out-earning Christopher and ends with both of them achieving top places in their respective fields of theater and journalism. But work necessitates that they live on different continents, and Cicely essentially raises their child alone. The novel ends with Christopher dying of tuberculosis, which is the disease that so many authors use to dispense with their female heroines, usually signaled by that violent cough and a spot of blood on the handkerchief. As Cicely and Kit head back to the United States after being abroad, she delivers the final line, and she says, "Next time we live, Christopher, we'll have time for each other. I think it's a really beautiful final line. And, this question of frenetic, career-hungry lives, this is a work-life balance, right? This is something we all think about to this day. Despite the fact these characters have a very tender affection for each other. I will say that the film adaptation is wonderful. It stars a young James Stewart in his very first starring role, and Margaret Sullivan as the theatrical aspirant who makes it big, while also being a loving, supportive mother to their son. It is one of the most unconventional and mature relationships I've ever seen in a Hollywood film, and I really admire the way that the film follows in the novel's footsteps of interrogating male hypocrisy and really probing the question of what a successful dual career marriage with a child might look like. Again, this is in the 1930s, and I don't have time to show a clip from the film, but it is uploaded as part of the PowerPoint. So if you download the PowerPoint, you will have access to this. And the final film I want to briefly mention is a remake that Douglas Sirk did in 1956. The first version of There's Always Tomorrow came out in 1934. The Douglas Sirk version stars Barbara Stanwyck as a wildly successful career woman who has not found time for love in her busy life, and Fred McMurray as a husband who cannot find happiness with his wife and family, who neglect him and take him for granted and just want him to work and make money so that they can live their lives. So that ends my Hollywood section. And before I start my final section, are there any questions that I can answer about Ursula Parrott in Hollywood?
Good deal. Thank you. Thank you. Again, encouraging everyone to please go ahead and enter your questions into the chat if you should have them. Marsha, I'll tell you, I was, sitting and watching the clip of Ursula, and again, you're right. If you blink, you will miss it.
Yes.
But tell me how you came about that. Where did you discover it, and what was it a part of?
Well, first, I've searched every moving image archive in the country, from Library of Congress to UCLA to anywhere I can think of, to see if there might be some newsreel footage or footage of her at a movie premiere. I have not found anything. She was on the radio a ton. I have not found anything. So that is just in the opening credits to the film. And so I've seen all of the films. And I was just thrilled when I saw that, because to see someone move even just a little bit, yeah.
I found myself watching her expression and
yes, that crooked smile.
Yeah, exactly. There's a question we have. Hello, Marsha. Great presentation. With the success of Ursula's work in Hollywood, do you think she created characters with stars in mind?
Well, it's interesting you should ask that, because MGM bought her second book, Strangers May Kiss, for Norma Shearer. So after Norma Shearer played in the first Ursula Parrott adaptation in The Divorcee, they followed it up with another Ursula Parrott-Norma Shearer combination. So it is entirely possible that she wrote that with her in mind. But both of those novels and almost all of Parrott's writing derived in some way from her life. And I really got to know that by reading her correspondence and figuring out what was happening in her personal life. So really, Norma Shearer was kind of the avatar for Ursula Parrott in this time period. So she did work some in Hollywood. And then, of course, she was writing for like Ina Claire, Claudette Colbert out of the Paramount Studios in New York City. She was supposed to write something for Gloria Swanson, but that fell apart because Gloria Swanson was having a legal battle with the studio. So I don't know really the answer to that question. I kind of doubt it, given the way she wrote. Again, I think she probably saw herself as the protagonist in all of these books.
Solid. Thank you. We'll reserve any additional questions for the end,
okay,
so we can continue on. Thank you.
Great. Well, actually, my shift to the final section, I'm going to use a Hollywood bridge before I share some thoughts about what it means to try to move Ursula from the margins to the center. So my Ursula Parrott recuperation project exists because of Hollywood, and it exists because of F. Scott Fitzgerald. In 1938, MGM made a significant financial investment in the most recent hot literary property authored by Ursula Parrott, and it was a story that had appeared in Cosmopolitan in February as part of a series called Grounds for Divorce. And this was the infidelity edition. If you're wondering if Ursula Parrott thought a lot about infidelity, I think you've answered your own question at this point. So MGM hired F. Scott Fitzgerald to adapt the film. So he was hired to read Parrott's story and turn it into a screenplay, and he worked on the script for months. At the University of South Carolina Special Collections, F. Scott Fitzgerald Holdings, the infidelity script, which was never made into a film, is there. I've read it, I've studied it. And it's a story of adultery and forgiveness, which could not fly in 1938. So it's interesting, that's post-code. 1934 is the year the production code starts getting enforced. So MGM could not get this story past the censors. So it was never made, despite the fact that it was being written as a major starring picture for Joan Crawford and was being produced by one of the studio's top producers, Hunt Stromberg. Writing to his daughter, F. Scott Fitzgerald described the scrapping of infidelity as an infinite disappointment. However, he explained that MGM was setting it aside a while till we think of a way of half-witting, half-wit Hayes and his Legion of Decency. And Will Hayes was the head of the Production Code Administration. And I sure wish someone would give this screenplay a go today. I mean, imagine the draw of F. Scott Fitzgerald and Ursula Parrott. It's like the super combo. But were it not for this now very famous author, F. Scott Fitzgerald, being hired to adapt a now forgotten author, Ursula Parrott, I would likely have never encountered Ursula Parrott's name, and she would still be languishing in that capacious gutter of forgotten American literary history. Which brings me back to that framing question, and I want to add something, not just who is Ursula Parrott, but I want to say a little bit about why she was forgotten, because I've spent a lot of time thinking about legacy tending during this project. Ursula Parrott's fame and fortune did not last. She struggled with a series of widely publicized scandals, and you have to give Ursula Parrott credit. She liked to go big in everything, especially this World War II scandal with a much younger private named Michael Neely Bryan, and it involved marijuana in New York City and liberating him from a minimum security stockade in Miami. It was very complicated and very prominent in the headlines of the newspapers of the day. Ursula Parrott struggled her entire adult life with alcoholism, with her physical and mental health, and she was never good with money, and she really hit rock bottom in the 1950s. But I will say, like so many jazz age authors, right, this doesn't explain it. You could say the same thing about F. Scott Fitzgerald. She died penniless and almost without notice in 1957. That's a picture of her tombstone. She's buried in the family plot in Brookline, Massachusetts. You're looking at also one of the only notices of her death, which was hidden basically in the middle of a column. So this is a tiny fragment of a column. I will say that I will be publishing our first ever obituary as part of the New York Times Overlook series. I hope that will be coming out this year. The number one reason that students all over the country, all over the world, read F. Scott Fitzgerald instead of Ursula Parrott today is that no one tended to her legacy. Like many of her female contemporaries, Ursula Parrott was categorized and dismissed as a women's writer. So the implication of that is that she wrote trivial and sentimental romances, although her tales were neither of these things. And her stories were about so many other things. They were about difficult divorces, phenomenally successful women's careers, single parenting, female piloting, adventuring and traveling, risk-taking on the Underground Railroad, combat and labor organizing, World War II veterans returning to civilian life, and even a nefarious Nazi plot. Romance writing, though, is a dubious corral in which to contain someone who used the genre to think about women's place in the modern world and much more. And this really does boil down to differential treatment. I published an article in The Conversation, which is free, open source online, about Ex-Wife and the Great Gatsby. Gatsby, which is a romance novel, right, by the way, sold 25% the number of copies as Ex-Wife did when it was first released. But F. Scott Fitzgerald had very influential advocates like Malcolm Cowley, Lionel Trilling, Edmund Wilson, who got Gatsby republished when it went out of print, and who wrote articles and books about it, and who taught it. So you're looking at an excerpt from Lionel Trilling in The Nation. You know, the root of Fitzgerald's heroism is to be found as it often is in tragic heroes, in his power of love. Fitzgerald wrote much about love. He was preoccupied with it, but it is not merely where he is being explicit about it that his power appears. It is to be seen where eventually all a writer's qualities have their true existence in his style. Even in Fitzgerald's early cruder books, or even in his commercial stories, and even when the style is careless, there's a tone and pitch to the sentences which suggests his warmth and tenderness, and what is rare nowadays, his mildness without softness. This is a really complex assessment to unpack, and very interesting to think about alongside the way women like Ursula Parrott, who also wrote about love, but in a very different way, get treated. It is extraordinary to me that the United States Army sent 155,000 free copies of The Great Gatsby to American servicemen overseas during World War II. I'm going to repeat that number, 155,000 free copies. All of these men overseas are reading The Great Gatsby, right? And they're going to come back and they're going to be teachers and professors, etc. When the American libraries rolled out their first World War II era victory book campaign in the fall of 1942, they warned potential donors to desist from donating any women's love stories, listing Ursula Parrott, along with Kathleen Norris, Faith Baldwin, and Eleanor Glynn as authors to be avoided. And so my point here is that writers and books are not important. They are made important, right? Ursula Parrott wrote about romance, but was not just a romance writer, though she was widely perceived and dismissed as one during her lifetime. What Ursula Parrott did often write about were the consequences for women of romance, sex, and careers at a time of unprecedented and rapid cultural change. Her stories depict what women living in a less rule-bound age often had to face alone, including how to support themselves and child rearing. And I think it's really interesting to watch the critical reception of the reissue of Ursula Parrott's bestseller from 1929, Ex-Wife. A lot of reviewers have encountered it, as I did, as a superb and surprisingly timely novel that fills in significant gaps in American literary history. And this is just a short excerpt from Molly Young's New York Times response to Ex-Wife. I'm tempted to simply type out a list of quotations from this book and call it a day, adding only a buy it now button at the bottom. But I'll be a responsible correspondent and write a proper endorsement. One of my favorite games is to read an obscure novel without knowing what year it was published and then try to guess the year. Usually it's a boring game and I come up with 24 months of pub date. Most books give themselves away, not this one. You could have knocked me over with a cat hair if you told me the year was 1929. It's not that the topics that are fresh, sex, love, marriage, infidelity, and work, have been fiction fodder since novels were born, but the approach, which feels too advanced even for now. And that's a really perfect distillation of the kind of timely resonance for readers today. I was on the San Francisco Experience podcast, and I said something on that podcast, which I just want to repeat now, which is, you read The Great Gatsby and you think of it as a period piece. It's very of its moment. And Parrott's book, Ex-Wife, manages to be both of its moment and our moment. And I really stand by that argument. I think that that Ex-Wife is very now in so many ways, and it just has a relevance, and it's able to kind of resonate across the century. And, who knows, maybe 50 years from now, Ursula Parrott will be shining brighter than F. Scott Fitzgerald or as bright. You never know, things change, right? So, I'm basically trying to do, what I can to commit to correct this, what I consider to be an omission in the American literature canon, and to remind people of the contributions that Ursula made to the world of literature, to Hollywood's representation of women in the Golden Age, and to ideas about career women and the challenges of work-life balance for women trying to do and have it all. And I really mean this. If you end up teaching this book in your classes, I would love to hear how it went. I would love to learn from you and what the experience was like in the classroom. So with that, I will wrap things up and say I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. There's a question actually that Wanda had, and her question is for basis of comparison, who who would you consider a 2023 version of Ursula? 2023, 2024, I should say.
Yeah.
That's an interesting question.
That's really interesting. You know, it's funny. I just default to this in part because I've been thinking about this so much, but the question I've been asked a bunch of times lately is who's going to play her in the biopic? And that's a fun game. If the audience has any ideas, drop them in the audience chat. Carey Mulligan and Frances Pugh are my top picks, and I hear them occasionally from people. But in terms of, right, you know, it's actually funny. There's a woman named Liz Lenz whose writing I really admire, and she just came out with a book called This American Ex-Wife, and it's about divorce. And I was on her podcast, which is how it came across my radar, but her book just came out like a week or a week and a half ago. I think it's on the New York Times bestseller list now. I would say she's a contender because she's basically writing about divorce, how it changed her life for the better. She's making a case for the importance of divorce. So I think maybe in some ways Liz Lenz is the 2024 Ursula Parrott.
All right. Mary has a question, actually a comment. She mentions that she would love to hear your thoughts on the son Mark's afterward in the new edition of Ex-Wife.
Yeah, thank you for asking that question, Mary. So Ursula Parrott's son, actually Ex-Wife was first republished, well, not first republished, but it was republished in the late 1980s by a small press, and then it went out of print very quickly. And so what McNally did was to use that afterword that Mark wrote in the 1980s because he's long deceased, and they used it in the reissue. So I think it's such a beautiful piece of writing because he's so frank and he's so, Ursula Parrott could not have been an easy mother, right? I mean, she was unconventional. She struggled with a lot of things. I think she tended to excess, right, as has already been established in my presentation today. And yet he did, I think he wrote about her life and her career with a great sense of kind of distance and a kind of equal parts admiration and frank criticism. And I think that's a beautiful thing. You know, the thing Ursula Parrott was proudest of was that she sent her son to Harvard on her own. She paid for him to go to Harvard. And she sent his diploma, a copy of his diploma, to her literary agent who had dropped her, years before because she got too complicated to work with. They remained friends. And she cared greatly that she was giving her son a kind of a modern education, traveling him around the world, really wanting him to have an independent and adventurous life. And so I love that somebody got to him to write that because there is no Ursula Parrott archive, right? She died penniless and obscure and nobody cared. And so there's no single place you can go and look at Ursula Parrott's papers. I had to cobble things together from all over the place. And so that's just a beautiful, beautiful document.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And again, Mary, thank you for that question. Miguel has a question. His question is what other authors or texts offer a window into women's lives during this time period?
Oh boy, God, there's so many. And to me, this is such a great decade for women authors in particular. Actually, if we go back to the the list of authors not to send to the boys overseas, I would read those. Kathleen Norris is super interesting. Faith Baldwin, Eleanor Glynn. I mean, all of these women were writing about women and women's lives in this period. And so there's just a wealth of writing that I think has not resurfaced because, once an author, once a book, once a story is not part of the kind of teaching curriculum, it's really hard to get it back in. I mean, I don't need to tell you all, it's a lot of work, right? It's a lot of effort to bring new material into your classes. And I think it's why something like The Great Gatsby, once it takes hold, it's really hard to make space. You have to exclude in order to include, right? So I think that any of those writers would actually be great to look at. And I mean, there's so many more. You could pick up any issue of the women's magazines in this time period and read what was being written, both the fiction and the nonfiction, and it's just, it's a revelation.
Good deal. And everyone, again, thank you all for your questions. I believe there's one more question that we'll bring to Dr. Gordon's attention, and then we will close out. And that question is from Magdalena. I think I heard you mention that this is the perspective of a white affluent woman, and I'm wondering how different or not you think this story would be told if a woman of color or a working class woman. Do you think it is important to recognize the intersectionality of identity when talking about women's issues during this period?
Thank you for that question. It's really important. I mean, obviously, race and class has so much to do with the life that Parrott had, right? She came from an affluent, an up-and-coming, affluent Boston family, was educated, had all the privilege that came with whiteness and of living in New York City, right? So I do think that that's an important consideration. There are certainly writers like Nella Larsen, for example, whose Passing you may be familiar with, which was also adapted into a really interesting film a couple of years ago, that might be an interesting text to look at. Some of the women writers of the Harlem Renaissance, again, very New York-centric, but to me, in some ways, like so much of the literary energy was coming out of New York in this time period. I think it's interesting to note that Ursula Parrott actually wrote one story or one book that's told from 4 different perspectives, and she wrote from an African-American perspective in one of the sections. And I wish somebody, a grad student would write an academic article about that, because I think it's a really beautiful representation. It doesn't broker in stereotypes. It's really a very thoughtful attempt to get into the mind of a woman who was not like her, but who was like her because she was a woman. And there's great empathy between the characters. So I do think it's important to consider the privilege that came with her both the way the way she was born as a white woman, and then the way she was raised in an affluent environment, and the way she ended up in a major urban center, and being able to go back and forth to Hollywood and all of the privilege that comes along with that. So thank you for that question.
Good deal. And thank you, everyone, for your questions, your input, your energy throughout the chat. As I look at the chat, I see everyone's posting thank you, and thank you so very much. Thank you for illuminating and very informative, highly informative. I think that's, everyone's taken away so much. And we had a little over 700 attendees here tonight. And I hope that you will all take this with you. I mean, it is so very important. And many of you said that you plan on incorporating it into your curriculum. So please keep up with everything that Dr. Gordon is doing. And please continue to follow all that's happening at the National Humanities Center as well. You can follow us on our social media feeds at National Humanities or at NHC Education. And I would also encourage you all to support the humanities education programs. The NHC education programs provide a bridge between the academic world and the working classroom. Your gift, no matter how modest, can open up a world of ideas for teachers and rekindle their enthusiasm for the subjects they teach by providing the knowledge and tools that they and their students need to make a difference. Next up, we have Dark with Excessive Bright, Music and Advocacy of Missy Mazzoli, which is scheduled for March 14th, 7 o'clock Eastern Time. So if you have not already signed up for that, please join us then. Marsha, we appreciate you so very much. You and I had an opportunity to talk on several occasions during your fellowship. And it's great to hear your voice again. And I look forward to continue to follow your work. And I'm looking forward to the next journey, the next path that you take as far as your research. So again, we appreciate you.
Thank you so much.
So very much. So, Everyone, continue to have an awesome, awesome week. Jeremy, I see your comments. Awesome stuff again. Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Mike, as always. Again, everyone, if I can ever support you or if you have any questions of me, please do not hesitate to reach out to me at mwilliams@nationalhumanitiescenter.org. We value you all and all the work that you're doing for students all around the country. We will see you all very, very soon. Take care and be well.